And again, thank you for being on this call today with Monica Rebella, CPA and President of Rebella Accountancy, which is a CPA firm that specializes in accounting, tax, and consulting services for hundreds of dentists in California. Our call topic today is What's Your Practice Worth and Getting Ready for Sale? If you're not a current client of Rebella Accountancy or if you've not met her, Monica Rebella is a CPA and has 27 years of accounting and tax expertise, which includes 13 years working with Big 4, Big 8 firms, and over 13 years experience working with dental practices. She's a past president of the Orange County, Long Beach chapter of the California Society of CPAs and is a member of the AICPA. She's conducted training sessions for accounting firms as well as lectured on tax and business matters to the California Society of CPAs, UCLA Dental School, and the Orange County Dental Academy. She runs her own firm in Tustin, California, providing accounting, tax, and consulting services for over 300 businesses throughout California, specializing in dental offices and small businesses. Monica, welcome to the call.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to everyone that's on live with us and will be listening later as well to share some time. Well, I get often asked by my clients, what's my practice worth, and how does the whole selling of the practice happen, the process? And I'm really excited to have Greg Beamer on with us tonight. Greg has been working with dentists to sell their practices and for kids coming out of the dental schools trying to buy a practice for a lot of years. He's helped hundreds of buyers and sellers with successful transitions. I also have used Greg with some of my clients to do appraisals for sellers, for buyers, looking at the value of practices. I know Greg has done that many times. He's been working in the brokerage industry since 1976. He actually got a degree, a bachelor's degree in society and justice from the University of Washington. So quite an interesting background. And he's been an expert witness. I really appreciate the appraisal Greg does for dental practices because he has been an expert witness. Back in the early 80s, Greg actually co-authored the first national lending program for lending, which is endorsed by the American Dental Association and has been used consistently since the early 1990s. So, Greg, we're really excited to have you on board with us tonight, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
And thank you for having me on board. Yes, this question is the one that's probably the most frequent that I get asked is, what is your practice worth? And it really depends on a number of items. We talked before the conference about if geography has a situation of impact on this, and yes, it does. In most of the United States, with the exception of a few areas that have to do with or where there's heavy metropolitan use like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, and New York City, these practice areas where there are large groups of people have a tendency to sell for more than practices that are, say, in Caldwell, Idaho, Columbus, Ohio. Those practice areas usually will draw no more than maybe 65 to 70% of the last year's gross in the business. In California, we're blessed from the seller side of it and maybe not so blessed from the buyer side of it, but most of the practices sell between 80 and 85%. Is the range of last year's gross collections. So that said, we then have to take a look at banking because we can have all the desire of what we want for our practice, but one of the biggest things is what can we get financed? A lot of times, sure.
Butt in here is a devil's advocate.
Sure.
So when we give these percentages, the 60 to 65 in the outlying areas of Idaho and other places, but 80 to 85% here in LA and Orange County, we're just using a rule of thumb because there's so many other factors involved in that, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But most of the time the people will say, what is my maximum? And everybody wants to get the best that they can. And so those percentages do play into effect. And certain parts, just so you know, also like outlying of Orange and LA County, it's harder to find people to go to Hesperia or people to go out to Bakersfield area at certain times because these practices are away from the mass of people.
Great. Well, I just wanted to clarify that before people start writing down 85%. Yeah.
True. Yeah, there are a lot of different variables, and we'll cover some of those tonight, hopefully.
Right.
Yeah. A couple years back, the banks were very loose, and they were basically giving very large, high percentages, and they were including working capital on top of it. But they've backed off of that in the last 4 or 5 years. They don't take into account what's going on in the current year. They're primarily interested in what happened to the last full tax year, and then whether or not the business in the current year is ahead of schedule, even, or declining. The declining practices are tough to, there has to be a good reason, and one of the purposes of having a broker or a good consultant or a good CPA is because somewhere along the line, the potential buyers and the bank is going to ask for the seller to tell the story. So people, as you know, when we're looking at this from a lending standpoint, first of all, it really does, it boils down to what is the practice doing. The banks have a rule of thumb, and this is a pretty good one. They lend that 80 to 90% is the max. And I put a little slide up here that a really just very fast example. If you have collections of $1 million, 800 to 900 is all that they're going to lend out the door. And they also want that buyer to have 10% of whatever that sales price is in the bank in savings.
Do they expect that 10% to be their down payment, Greg?
No. That happened for a while, and then they kind of got away from it. The reason that they're looking at that for that 10%, Monica, is because there are expenses that a buyer has when they go into this, and in most of these sales, the accounts receivable is either too little or not included in the sales price. So the bank's looking for a buyer to have something in the bank to be able to work the first month or two until their accounts receivable start to roll in.
Because they're not doing much of the working capital anymore.
They're not. Some of the banks are doing, I've got to back up on that. Some of the banks are still doing working capital loans. The only thing is, whatever that sales price is and the working capital plays into what that 80 to 90% max is going to look like. So, for instance, in the rule of thumb here that I have on the screen, if somebody was selling their practice for $800,000 and it was right at that mark where the bank's not going to lend any more and the person needs another $50,000 or $60,000 of working capital, the bank's not going to be able to lend them the money. So they may have to dig into their savings for that extra $50,000. And that's where it gets down to kind of like going one-on-one with what have we actually got our hands around on a particular sale, on a particular practice, and what the banks are doing at that particular time, because they do change. They can change fast.
Would you suggest in that point that they consider buying the receivables?
That is a very good possibility. If the receivables are clean, and it would be the receivables under 90 days past due. The bank's going to want to see them current. Right.
Mm-hmm. So that means doctors, you're looking to sell, clean up your receivables because they're not going to give you any money for anything 90 days or over.
That is correct. And the interesting part is we have a number of doctors who over the years have not really paid attention to closing out every month. And so it's always a good time to clean up your back room.
Right, there you go. Okay.
Yeah. So once they start this process, one of the things that we talked about and we're looking at on this next slide is how do they increase the value of their practice. The first thing is that most of the doctors that are coming out of school are looking for the practice to be at least somewhat up to date. 10, 15 years ago, we were preaching have an intraoral camera. And the preaching in the last 5 years is have digital. And those aren't cheap. I mean, the digital x-rays are coming down. I mean, I can remember the first intraoral camera that was ever financed in the United States because I happened to be the guy doing it. And they were $40,000 a pop. Mm-hmm. And they were big black boxes, and they had a tendency to sit in the seller's back room and gather dust. They were a toy. now you really can't almost operate without one if you want to be profitable. So the digital x-rays are coming down. When these things first started out, they were very expensive. But you can do a good unit for not a lot of money. And I'm not saying to go out and buy the most expensive thing on the block, but I'm saying the people that are coming out of school are different now than they were 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. And the mindset is different from the buyer that we had 10 years ago and even 5 years ago. By that I mean there's some recent research that's shown in the old days when somebody came out of dental school, 85% of those people wanted to own their own practice and fly solo. It's now 57%.
Wow.
There's about 28 to 30% that want to be in with somebody else, and that means a partnership of some type, which is a very strange place to play, but that's for another topic. And then there are actually 10% of them that want to enter into groups where there's more than three or more. So the buyer pool kind of shrunk in that regard, and they're coming out with a higher tech background when it comes to not so much the dentistry, but the office and the business and the presentation, like the digital x-rays, convenience. We've got a lot of very tech-oriented people coming out of dental schools. We always have, actually. Their disc type, their personality types are pretty much engineer-oriented. You know, one of my friends once told me, he says, there's a reason it's called a bridge.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That engineering. Well, so I just want to kind of step back about being up to date on your equipment, is that we're not saying for doctors that are looking to sell now to go run out and buy all bright, shiny new equipment and go into debt to be at that point, but we're saying please remember that this process of getting ready to sell is looking 5 years or more out and getting yourself ready, mentally getting yourself ready, getting all the finances in order, and really looking at what your practice is like. And if you're looking that far out, yes, get yourself up to date, but work with your CPA because you want to make sure that what you're doing makes sense for you financially, both now, if you're a few years out, and what you're going to actually sell it for. So in other words, are you spending a lot of money? Is it really going to give you that much more bang for the buck when you sell it? And if you do it enough years out, you're going to benefit from this new equipment, not just the buyer. So
absolutely. In fact, that's one of the most important things that you just hit on there, is that this helps to rejuvenate the seller's energy into the practice when they have the technology that allows them to do things better, quicker, faster, and cleaner. And you mentioned 5 years out. You know, we've talked in this industry for years amongst brokers and lenders that a seller needs to start looking at things at least 5 years out. And I'm sure, and you know much better than I do, but there's recent research from the Putnam Investment Group back in Boston that they're showing in their research that business owners who begin planning for their succession 10 years ahead of time have an 85% success rate. But if they plan 2 or less years out, that success rate drops from 85% to 25%. Wow. So this is one of those things where you have to kind of look at it as a long haul, not only for your buyer, but also for you. You want to go out on a good, positive note, increasing your values, increasing your receivables, and increasing that collections, so that we have a really good, dynamic, vibrant place to sell.
I agree. And I'm sure you see this more than I do, is that I find doctors who have already been semi-retired for a few years and now they're getting ready to sell, and their practice has decreased. And so they're seeing a declining value because they were cutting back, I think they were just trying to figure out what was it like if they just cut back versus sell. And so they've had a declining practice, and now they're getting ready to sell, and they're kind of surprised over that. So anything they can do to keep themselves rejuvenated, or even bringing an associate in to keep those numbers higher, is an important thing to get the maximum you can for your practice.
Absolutely, and buyers like to buy vibrant practices. That's something that's often overlooked, is that if you're buying a practice in today's market, you're coming out with $200,000 to $300,000, $400,000. I had one orthodontist with $750,000 in student debt.
Wow.
So when they step out the door and they've got their degree, they've got an immediate, let's say, $300,000 to $350,000 nut to crack. Then they've got to buy a practice and buy a house and buy a car and raise a family. And so when they're looking for practices to buy, they're looking for practices that are doing well because they need that income to cover all this stuff. And
well,
the banks
actually
look
the
at it
highest
the same way.
That's the biggest number I've ever heard, Greg. So
I'm sorry to shock you on that one, but it was true, and it actually was out of USC.
Wow.
But, the average is $300,000. And from talking to my buyers, and I'm talking Western UCLA, USC, Loma Linda, it really doesn't matter where you're coming from. They have that debt. And,
yep.
You do have a couple that are from wealthy families that is just paid for, but boy, that's not the norm.
Yeah. Wow.
So the other thing that we find out is that it, along with doing the obvious, which is keep your practices built up as you can. You mentioned bringing in an associate. Good idea. As long as, and I'm not a lawyer, I'll go right out here on the box and say that, and I'm definitely not a CPA. I leave those things to those people, but I'm allowed to have opinions. My opinion is that anybody that you bring into your office, and I don't care if it's the front desk or an associate, everybody in that office should have a trade secret agreement of some type that's signed. And sellers who prepare for this ahead of time, it makes it a lot easier when the buyer knows that anybody that's there has already signed a trade secret agreement, which basically says that if that employee or independent contractor ever leave that practice, the patient information is sacrosanct and cannot be distributed, given, referred, shared with anyone else.
If they get a good employee manual, that should be in there. And if they don't know Anita York, she does legal for dentists, labor law for dentists, that she'd be happy to get that in place for you because it is really important. But can we back up to the student loan thing a minute? Because, I've talked to many associates coming out, and they know their debts are high, and they're saying, I can never buy a dental practice. I've got too much student loan. The banks won't loan to me. And I see plenty of associates buying practices knowing they have student loan on top of the loan for the office. So can you address that a second?
Sure. The interesting thing is that there's a hierarchy of risk, and the lenders know it, and it's been pretty much historically sound for, since 1980 at least. There are three safest types of loans to make in the United States, to three different groups. The best loan to make is to a veterinarian. And the reason is because people will take care of their dogs and their cats before they take care of themselves. The second is mortuaries. It's a sure bet. And the third is dentistry. Interestingly enough, it has one of the lowest... Are you with me? Hello?
Cut out there, but we're back.
Okay. It has one of the lowest failure rates of businesses in the United States. And it's absolutely phenomenal. And so because of that, because the risk is low, the bankers are more willing to turn aside from the situation that has to do with looking at the student debt. And so they will pretty much push that to the side. And it's really a benefit, thank God, that they will do that.
I have heard the banks say, some do push it completely aside. I've had others say, we know about your student loan debt. You've got to keep it at the minimum because you have a bigger payment here with us. So we don't want to see you putting big monies towards your student loan until we get to a certain point in our loan.
Well, that's true. The only good news is that thank God, most of them, unless it's really an obnoxious amount of money, or unless the doctor's been out for 15 years and they're still carrying $200,000 of student debt, the banks take a look at the overall picture on somebody.
Right.
I mean, they're looking at all their needs. And that's why sometimes as a broker, we know that our doctors are pre-qualified, but we don't really know what their total debt is. That always happens when it gets to the bank level. Right. And the banks are thank God, they're very quick to tell us if somebody's not in line.
Yeah, very good. So you have a few other things about increasing the value. So we talked about up-to-date equipment, but look at least 5 years out before you even think about starting to buy new equipment. Best is if you look 10 years out. But you have a few other things here.
Yeah, the second one is just a good lease. And if you're looking 10 years out or 5 years out, you probably will come up against renewing your lease. And if you do that, one of the things, and I can't stress this enough, is to have somebody, a good attorney, looking at that lease to make sure that they have the best lease that you can pass on to a buyer. And if you can capture your options. In other words, if you can get a 5-year lease and you're thinking of retiring in 5 years, go ahead and get a 5-year option. Because if you are retiring out in 5 years, you don't want your lease to expire right when you're selling the practice, because it opens a whole bunch of things up. Having the assignment there doesn't hurt you, because you can always come to the end of the 5 years, plan to sell it in about 4.5, be out of it 5, and not even exercise the option. But what happens if you get right up against the end of it and you don't have a buyer in place? Or there's no option to provide, or the landlord's decided you're going to retire out, so they start looking at marketing your space without your knowledge, and you find out when you go to get the renewal that, oh, geez, we thought you were going to retire. So just having a good handle on your lease, knowing that your lease is well written, paying, there's that old saying, you get what you pay for. This is one of the areas where you get what you pay for. And you've got to have somebody that's familiar with dental, and you've got to have somebody that's really good with leases. And there's some good ones out there.
Yep, there are. Absolutely.
Yeah. So the other thing, and this is kind of it sounds like a no-brainer, but it's not. I can't tell you how many people will go to seminars to try to figure out how to increase their patients coming in the door, but they can't afford a couple gallons of paint. The facility has to be clean.
Yeah.
And I've walked through more than 1,500 offices, and I can tell you that there are a handful that I've come out of, and I can't imagine anybody opening their mouth in there. And these are very super people as sellers, very nice folk, but the place just looks like a bomb went off. And this is, I walked into one just recently, won't even say what area, but I walked in, the first 3 operatories were beautiful. But in iShot was the 4th operatory that they've been using as a storage facility. If I was a patient walking into that office or a buyer walking into that office, I'd turn right around, I'd be cordial, and I'd leave. Baseboards. Quick story. I put myself through college as a surgical janitor in a hospital. Very first thing I was taught in the janitorial business. Top of lights, top of counters, corners. And I can't tell you how many times as a broker I've walked into an office, taken my finger, ran it across the top of the light bar, and it comes back full of dust. It just doesn't work. So if somebody's looking to sell, and it doesn't cost a lot of money, and I'm not saying buy new furniture or any of that stuff, but if you look at your carpet, and if you look at your baseboards, and you see that things are dirty, clean them. I had one office that I went into, and I actually had to sit the doctor down and say, you have a hygiene problem with your front desk.
Wow.
You need to go up to your front desk, and you need to tell her that she needs to come back showered and cleaned up and with a stain-free set of scrubs tomorrow. And if she can't afford them, you take care of it. But you cannot have someone looking that way in your office. dirty shoes. You know, a lot of people right now wear, you know, sneakers around the office, but they're not clean. Fingernails. I mean, the clean facility that I'm talking about is everybody involved. If the doctor's sitting there, I had 3 doctors in 3 offices in the same center, drawing off the same water supply, the same electrical supply, the same patient pool, and the same staffing pool. One made $150,000, one made $478,000, and the other one made $950,000. And all you had to do was walk into those 3 offices, and you could tell what was attractive and what wasn't.
In the same center?
The same center. I mean, literally door to door.
Wow.
They were in a little square, and they all looked at each other's doors. And they all passed each other in the parking lot in the morning. One guy came in with a tie. One guy open neck. And the other guy, believe it or not, I'm not joking here, T-shirt. And I just, you know.
Yeah.
So what seems like common sense, that's an enigma in and of itself, dichotomy, but it is very important to just, and I tell this to my sellers when I go out to list or potentially list, I walk in and I'm not Santa Claus with a good tooth fairy. You have me there to get the best that we can get and present the best show. And that is a huge part of it. And it's amazing what happens because I'll have a doctor that's really never thought about it. My buyers, I tell them in order to prevent this happening to them, because it is a deal of awareness, is that once a week, when everybody's gone, they take a pad and they go and they sit in each one of their operatories and take a look around. And if they see something they don't like, fix it. Amazingly simple. But you get so used to being in a place after 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. I have one doctor that I was working with out in the Reseda area. He's 83 years old. He started practicing in 1957. I was 6.
Wow.
And he still has patients coming through his door. But you know what? You could eat off the floor.
So we've got to make sure you have to have a clean facility. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but make sure it's clean and everybody in there is presenting the best possible. So for the doctors, they just got to clean up their act. It's just
just have to look the part. You know, you're a professional. You've gone to school for all those years to present a persona, you know, and to have your persona as being a DDS. Well, then it's got to look like a place to go into.
So we got a couple other things, right?
Yeah.
So we got
stable numbers and staff. Just make sure that you know what you're doing, that you're closing your books out, that you're properly coding, that you're not overstaffed. This is a very hard thing for some doctors, especially in some of these areas. They get so used to the staff and they just keep them forever. And so it's not saying to get rid of staff, but watch what you're doing when you're trying to do percentages of increases to salaries. Talk to your CPA and find out what is the norm in your area, and try not to get too much above it. I mean, I had one doctor in Beverly Hills who was paying somebody $27 an hour to sterilize instruments, and then he wondered why he couldn't get top dollar. Solid recall in place, very, very important. I don't care how it's done. It just needs to be there. But pre-book card and phone is the most general thing that we normally see. The biggest thing in that line is collecting the copay.
Right.
If you don't do it, you're working against the law, and the minute that your buyer finds out or your broker finds out you're not collecting it, you're not going to get what you want. And I have a lot of doctors that fight it, say, but the guy down the street's doing it. Well, what it's a little bit of a rampant thing. Everybody gets going that way. The only problem is, number one, we're not supposed to go that way. Number two, your buyer's going to play straight. So your buyer's not going to buy it if he thinks he's going to lose half the patient base. And the last thing is that you got to remember that if you walk into a medical doctor's office, you do not pass that front door without paying your copay.
Well, there was a doctor in Long Beach that was doing this with the longshoremen, because I had clients in that area, and he was finally, because it's against the contract, it's illegal, And finally, the different insurance companies came back at him. He had to close down. He absolutely closed down his office. So it was better for everyone in the community because he's out of business.
Mm-hmm.
So it does come back to bite them. So.
Yeah, it does. You got to play fair. You know, if you've got everybody, of course, is looking for the good location and visibility and parking and all that other stuff. To be honest with you, there are buyers for every location type. There are buyers who just want to be in high-rises. There are buyers who just want to be in a retail center. There are buyers who just want to be in a group building of medical professionals. But it is important to have your visibility if you have it, to keep it up. If you have signage, make sure the letters all light up at night. Because, believe it or not, buyers will drive by at night.
Yep.
And I've had doctors call me back. Says, I don't know what's going on with the guy, but half of his sign's off.
Yeah.
Watch your monument signs if you have monument signs. Make sure that everything's spelled correctly. Good mix of procedures is just basically that. It's very hard to sell somebody who's just doing cleanings and then they want to be, get the price that they would as if they were doing cosmetic restoration. It just doesn't work. Yeah. So, do what you know how to do. A lot of people refer out. But there, as I'm sure you've noticed, there are a lot of people traveling endos, traveling ortho, traveling periodontists.
Yep. That's
the
newest thing.
Yep.
That's the newest thing is there are companies out there that have all of those specialties that will come to your office and do it. So, but it's the number one thing a lot of associates buying in look at. It's like, I can do my perio. I'm going to, have a better perio program. I'm going to do all the endos. So, it's one of the things they look at, right? So when they're looking for these practices.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why this last thing here, accurate financial input and reports, because we can put almost anything we want into those computers with certain qualifiers. But if you have somebody coding things incorrectly, or you're not coding things in, or you're not keeping track of what you're referring out, let's say that you refer out endo. And a lot of the doctors years ago weren't trained in endo in school, and now a lot of them are. So let's say that on the GP side you can get $600 a case for that. If a seller can demonstrate to a buyer that they've referred out over the last year 50 endos, for one a week basically, that's $30,000 that buyer's seeing coming to the bottom line if they just can drop the gate.
Right.
That makes that place attractive.
Very attractive, yeah.
Very attractive.
That just increased that top line. So very good.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So now let's switch to the other side. What is going to cause you to get a lower price?
Well, it's pretty much a reversal of the previous slide, but it brings some stories. It's old equipment. And this gets back to also the cleaning thing. You can have old equipment that is very well maintained, or you can have a beautiful office, but there's a rust spot down by the bottom of the chair or on the base of the unit. Simple, little bit of cosmetic work up here for a little elbow grease and hand power, as my mom used to say, and you can get it fixed. Yeah. But old equipment, for the most part, people just want to see that they need something where they can sit down and go to work doing dentistry with pretty much the same thing they came out of school with. If it's fold-down Ritter, it's probably not going to go over too good. But if it's Belmont's the workhorse, ADEC, those are pieces of machinery that just seem to go on and on and on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can recover them, but at a certain point they do end their life. But if you've maintained them well and you've made a good living, they'll last a little bit longer. That buyer doesn't want to look at having to put in $100,000 of new equipment.
No, and I'll tell you, every one of them that I have that walk in a door to look at a practice, that's in the back of their mind.
Right.
It's always something that if there's probably one excuse of why they won't move forward to put in a written offer, I just don't know, Greg. I might have to put an extra $50,000 or $60,000 in this thing just to bring it up to speed.
Yeah, computers and some of the equipment that's just not well maintained, or it's not efficient enough. And again, we're not saying the year before you sell to go do this. We're saying we got to plan ahead on this stuff, but maintain and make it clean. So good.
Yep.
And then we flip over with the leases. We, talked about that.
Poorly written or month-to-month. There have been some real tragic stories on the month-to-month shot, and I'm sure you've heard them as well. Doctor comes to the end of the lease and decides, well, I'm going to sell in a year or two. I'll just leave it on month-to-month. And it's primarily because they don't want to be responsible for having to co-guarantor that assignment. In simple English, most of these leases, the doctors don't read them, and they just sign them. And that's why it gets back to that thing of making sure that you have an attorney involved that understands and can protect you. Because that attorney's not just protecting the rate. That attorney's protecting the getting out of this.
Right.
I've had a lot of doctors get shocked that it costs them $1,500 a throw to have the credit checked on a potential buyer. And then I have to go, well, doctor, it was in your lease when you signed it 3 years ago. It says right there it's going to cost $1,500 a throw. And they need 60 days notice. You got everything geared to go out in 45 days, and the landlord says, well, we don't even have to get back to you for 2 months.
Right.
So that's the poorly written part, and if you have to spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 to get your hands on a good lease that's really reviewed, it's worth every dime of it.
Absolutely. There's just too many strange things, and lenders that, or at least landowners that put in those things. You really need it reviewed.
Monica, you would think that with the economy the way it is, that landlords would be a little easier to work with.
Nope, they aren't.
No. It's absolutely the opposite. They become a nightmare. And they're the wild card. Of all the things involved in your sale, they're the one thing that your broker cannot control. We're totally at their mercy.
It's the one thing that'll hold up everything. Can't get the lease renegotiated with the lender or with the landlord. And many times I have seen that the seller has had to be on it for a year to make sure that the buyer is going to be able to make that. I mean, it's phenomenal what they will and won't do, and it's their shot. It's their call.
Well, see, that's one of the things, and we won't belabor this too much more, but it's a very important point that you just mentioned. If you take a look, if you line up 100 leases, I will guarantee you $100 bill that 90 of those have a clause in it that says that in the event of an assignment, that the tenant should be responsible for the remainder of the lease term as a co-guarantor for the assignee. For the remainder of the lease term.
Yep.
So if you've got 4 years left, you're going to be on that sucker for 4 years. Now, an attorney drafting a good lease up front can address that you're only on it for maybe a year. Because the failure rate within a year on a new practice is almost zero.
Yeah.
It's safe. But 4 years?
Yeah. 4 years, you're really out there. Yeah.
You're kind of hanging out there just praying it all works. And there are some that have had to come back and take over practices. Thank God, just a handful.
Yeah.
But it's still not a position you even want to, if you can spin yourself out of it, why even start? Get into it.
Well, we've covered the pride of ownership. We've talked about the overpaid staff or short term. I mean, you really need to have your solid staff in there. Not that everyone has to have been with you forever, but you do need to have a solid staff in there. They're the continuation of the patients. They're the ones that are going to smooth the transition over.
And it's very amazing because that brings up one subject that we haven't, it's not really stamped on here, but it's kind of important. A lot of the sellers want to keep everything very confidential so their staff doesn't know that the sale's taking place.
Yep, absolutely.
And the broker, a good broker, because, we're not fools, we're actually fairly well trained in psychology of the mindset of buyers and sellers. We've chosen this profession, is that we know that somewhere along the line that buyer's going to want to meet that staff. So I tell the sellers, listen, it's your call, but please be advised that if they find out from somebody else and it's not coming from you, you could have a staff attrition problem.
Right.
It's much easier to just let people know that, I mean, they're looking at the doctors that are, especially if it's retiring, they're wondering in the back of their minds, how long can Greg keep going?
Right.
You know, and if the dude drops, do I have a job? So sometimes it's really nice to let them know, hey, I've decided that I'm going to think about this, and I'm hiring a professional firm to give me some people to take a look at his options. So you don't want, you know, what do you want? Do you want tall, dark, and handsome? We'll do the best we can.
Yeah.
And you let them know up front, hey, I'm just being real. I don't want you to have to hear it from somebody else. You've trusted me all these years. You need to trust me to make sure I'm going to pick my proper predecessor. I'd like you involved in the process. I'm going to make the final determination, but I'd like you involved in the process. And then it goes a heck of a lot cleaner. And for those who just can't let go of that control, that's okay, but there does come a time before the close when the buyer's going to say, I got to meet him.
Right. Yeah, it will happen. Yeah.
It will. Okay.
We talked about the recall, so we know about that, and we talked about the copay. You've got to get it. And we've talked about a poor location.
And that's a tough one because sometimes you can't move out of where you are.
Right.
But then it roils down to, can you take the can of paint outside? And I don't mean this to be facetious, but if you have a small center, you know, you want to make sure that you're standing on that landlord, again, part of this whole lease thing, that they keep the outside of the center looking attractive. Make sure that the parking lot is swept. Make sure that if somebody does some graffiti on your windows, that you go get the stuff that you can, you know, replace or wipe off. Make sure that your doors open clean. Make sure that they're not dirty in the tracks. It gets down to looking in the corner again. Your sign works, cobwebs on things. Things that, if there's a little landscaping, that you don't have the thing filled with cigarette butts from people that walk by in the retail center. You got to sometimes step out and do something that your landlord may not want to do, but you need to have a clean entrance. Once they're inside, you should have that fixed. Because sometimes coming in, you just, maybe not visibility, but you got to have cleanliness.
Yeah, you know, and especially in some of the older places, you know, the landlords may not be keeping them up completely, but you want to make sure that your patients and the potential buyers feel that, you know, it is clean, it is safe.
It's got to smell good.
Yeah.
Sorry, but
it's got to look good and smell good.
It's got to look good and smell good. It's like, you know, that what's the name of the guy, the plumber? You know, I promise that my plumbers will show up on time and they'll smell good.
Smell good.
Mike Diamond. Hey, it works.
Good.
That advertising works. But there's one other thing though, back in part of this. I'll make it brief, but one of the most important things for doctors is the sellers start to think, how do I increase what I'm doing here? I'm not getting any new patients. You know, what can I do to get myself to the next plateau, to build this up a bit? And you can do something so simple and it doesn't cost you anything more than 10 or 15 seconds. And it's between the chair and the front door. Somebody's got to hear something like this. Monica, I just want to know we appreciated you coming in today. We know you have options. We're always looking for more patients just like you. So if you have somebody that needs a dentist, we really would appreciate it if you'd refer them to us.
I so agree, and it just isn't done. They think they can put a little sign out. The little sign is fine, but really you need to thank them for coming in and let them know that you are accepting new patients. What the patients think is, you're busy. You're seeing me and other patients. You're busy. You aren't looking for more business. You have to let them know.
Everybody wants to be special. And it's two more things. I can keep it short. You're worried about whether or not we're going to be able to fill this hour, and I'm telling you, they've got this thing covered. Okay. One of the things is that when you are doing any major work on somebody, call them that night. If you're working on 6 or 7 or 8 people or even 10, 12 people a day, you're going to be talking to answering machines half the time. But you want the patient needs to know that the doctor is doing something that no other dentist in the area is doing. And I'll tell you, night calls is a wonderful way to establish allegiance from your patient pool. I had actually one doctor call me in to tell him how he could boost things up, and I asked that question. And the husband, it was a female doctor, and the husband pipes up. He owned a business, and he says, "Well, I'm sorry, but that stuff just isn't. That doesn't work." I said, "Oh, really?" And I turned around, and one of his staff was sitting over in the corner, and I says, "Sir, can I ask you a question?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "What kind of car do you drive?" He says, "Well, I drive a BMW." I says, "Nice set of wheels. What is that? $400 to $500 to have that thing serviced?" He says, "Yep." I says, "Well, question for you. Does the dealership ever call you after the service and ask you how the service was?" He says, "Every single time." I said, "Would you ever leave that dealership?" His answer was, "No. I'm special to them." And I turned around, I looked at the guy, I said, "You want to know why your wife's not getting more patients in the door? Keep that mindset."
Yeah, that's good.
You know, it's so simple, and people, and it'll only take maybe 15 minutes of your day, but 15 minutes of your day to ensure that your patient base stays stable if the economy crashes or they lose their job or whatever, to me, that's kind of a no-brainer.
Yep, I think it is amazing. I've had some procedures, and I'm like, wow, the doctor's calling me after hours to make sure I'm okay. And wow, I didn't know doctors called like this. So absolutely, it makes you feel important, and you're tied to them. You're going to tell people about it.
And you know, that's the funny thing is that when people don't realize that it's a numbers game. If you've got 1,000 patients and you tell 1,000 patients that they're special, chances are you're going to hit on a few that actually will tell that to their friends.
Absolutely.
And you don't need many. You know?
Yeah,
20 or 30 a year does really well.
Well, you know, you hope that you have a good new patient flow every month, but it's certainly one, it's the cheapest, and two, it's actually the best way to get new patients. So all these other marketing things are great, but your number one source, which is free, is treating your patients well and asking them, or letting them know you're looking for more patients. So,
you know, you hit on a very important thing when you just went through that, and that is that there's one other thing that is really, I don't know, I've had doctors really get interesting with this, but when you're building your websites and you have your website, you have to make sure that every word in that website is spelled correctly.
Oh, yeah.
You have to make sure that there is nothing that says under construction. And you need to visit it once or twice, maybe every quarter, just to make sure that nothing's moved. I had a doctor sit down and hand me a letter that somebody had produced as an advertisement. And he hands it to me and he says, "Greg, what's wrong with that?" And I looked at the letter and I says, it says, "Dear valued client," and V in value is not capitalized. And he went, "That's what I saw, and that's where I stopped." So it's kind of like when a record, in the old days when you had those things, you know, you put the arm down and the music would play. You know what happened if you smacked the table near it? That sucker skipped a beat, right?
Scratch right over your album.
Scratch right over your best part. And the thing is that that's what I akin the grammar in these websites. They have to be, you would not believe how many of them don't have full sentences. And the sad thing is most of the things that we're doing these days are written and done by people who, you know, they come out of high school and half of them can't spell anyway. But it's you. Whatever you put on that website is you. Whatever your staff looks like is you. Whatever your business looks like is you. It's not just your dental skills. It's how are you perceived?
It's absolutely true. You're putting it out there, and that's what the buyers have to be. The buyers look at it, they're going to say that's the kind of practice. I either fit in that kind of practice or I don't. Yep.
And always one last thing, and this is down when it gets into the hardcore where you're actually going to list it or you've listed it. Sellers, make sure that you take the time to visit with your potential buyers. Do not just hand your broker a key and say, you show it. This is a very personalized business. Interestingly enough, one of the few businesses in the world where somebody's sticking their hands inside your body while you're fully awake. Okay? There's a trust issue here. And as a seller, you want to meet that person who's going to take over what you've built, and you want to shake their hand and look in their eye, and you want to size them up.
Well, so that brings up a question. So the seller is going, or the potential buyer is going to want to come see the office. Do you suggest the selling doctor be there when the potential buyer's there to see the office, or do you suggest the broker just go with the buyer?
No, I always, in fact, and I've done this for years. I've done it all different types of styles. The very best way that it happens is when I say back and have the buyer and the seller set a time on a weekend or a night when they get together. The buyers walk the practice. They know within 45 seconds whether or not it's the right one for them.
Yeah.
And then they want to look in that person's eye and shake their hand and see it. And if a broker's standing there, sometimes it can actually be a detraction. So it's not because I just don't feel like driving over there that night. I know that there are certain times to be involved and certain times not to. I'll do it either way, whatever the seller wants. But I'll tell them that the reality of it is, doctor to doctor, that bond is made inside of 3 to 5 minutes. It's not an hour and a half. It's
Good.
that quick.
Yeah.
Because that seller's been sizing patients up their entire career. They know when they walk in that room and look in that patient's eye, they know exactly what they're up against 99% of the time. It's just one of those psychological, sociological truths.
Well, and I would also think, as a seller, that you've got a lot of stuff in your office that I think that you'd want to be there. There's patient charts, there's confidential information, there may even be some, narcotics that may not be completely locked up. I would just think for a whole ream of reasons that the selling doctor should be there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's the best way to go. And I've had sellers talk to me after the fact and going, you know what? I really understand now why you told me I needed to do that.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, what else do we want to impart from them about their practice and getting the right price and how you do that? What else do we want to impart upon him here at the last part, Greg?
Well, I think that the big thing is realize that this is a task that's going to take some time. And sometimes when you're in a certain routine, it can get a little bit overwhelming. And that's why you either have a consultant. A lot of people rely on their CPAs to do, a lot of this type of posturing for this. But really, that's where a good broker comes in, or at least a good consultant that has done this an awful lot, because you want to continue to do dentistry while you're going through the sales process. One thing that is coming to mind is when you have your accepted offer, don't take your foot off the gas.
Yeah.
Until the check is in the bank, you own it. And there will be a clause in your contract that will allow you to come in and finish things that you have started on individual procedures. Just understand that, you're going to need to come in after the close and finish those things up. And I personally do that from a malpractice standpoint. I don't like two people working on the same procedure. It's just a danger to me. So I recommend that the seller keep their foot on the gas. And the other thing is, don't push it to the floorboard. If you start burning the midnight oil to make that last round, you're going to scare the heck out of your buyer, you're going to scare the heck out of your bank, and you're going to cause your broker to have arrhythmia. Just don't do it. Just keep it steady. Just do what you've been doing and coast into it, and it'll all work out.
So you did bring up one point that I do want that I hear about often. Is it a good idea for the seller to stay on for a while with the buyer, or is it situation by situation?
It reminds me of a song, and part of the lyrics are, should I stay or shall I go? And in this deal, there's 3 or 4 things that we can quickly cover on that. The first thing is it has to be something that's economically feasible. If it's not economically feasible for you to stay there a couple days a week, and you want to stay there a couple days a week, then you're just going to have to live up to the fact that you weren't making enough in there for a buyer to buy it and pay the bank, pay all the bills, and then pay you. So first it has to be economically feasible. And you know, because you get asked all the time, can I hire this person back and how much should I pay them, and all that stuff comes up.
Right.
The second thing is if you can work back, you want to make sure that you have a good binding independent contractor agreement that clearly lays out how things are going to work, and a good attorney can provide you with that. And it's important for both you and your buyer to have something in writing. Usually they run in 6-month renewal intervals. And those are very specific things right down to who provides supplies and instruments and all that other stuff.
Independent contractor is a problematic thing in dental practices these days, so make sure you have a good labor law attorney if you're going to think you're going to go that way.
Absolutely, but you've got to know what you're going to nail down, because when the date comes, that seller's expecting to be coming to work. And the other thing is that you need to outline how you're going to handle things as far as scheduling. Because normally if there's a problem, it's because Dr. New has to make all the money, the buyer, and so all the heavy stuff's scheduled over there, and the seller's in doing stuff that isn't all that. Or it gets weighed the other way. There has to be an equality to it. Everybody has to play fair.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
okay.
Because if it won't finance out, the bank won't fund it.
If it has never been a 2-doctor practice, you can't even think that you're going to come back and work when they've got that kind of debt service that they have to do. They can't afford to pay you and pay the debt and make any money. But I have heard even in those situations where the buyer says, "But I want them to stay on." And it's for a lot of reasons. One, the buyers don't know much about dental office management.
Right. They can have them on as a consultant for 5 or 6 months. Yep. They can have them come in a day or 2 a month for the first 6 months.
Right.
And you could, depending on what the pricing is, that can be, worked out in the price of the practice. But as far as, something has to make probably upwards of $750,000 to $800,000 before you can talk about coming back in as an associate on a regular basis. There just won't be enough money there to cover the deck.
Oh, more than that, yeah.
Or more than that, yeah.
Well, great. So I see that you've got a great slide here at the end. So let's go to your offer for everyone.
Well, my offer to anybody who's listening or listens in the future, that I'll do a free practice for sale tune-up evaluation, and I'll personally come out and take a look at the office, and we'll go over the items. I have 10 biggest items that I look for. Most of them I kind of covered tonight in one way, shape, or form. But we'll sit down and make it personalized so that we can kind of get a grip on where we're going. And then you'll be involved from the financial planning standpoint and the tax advantage or disadvantage standpoint, because we don't like surprises except at Christmas and my birthday. So most of my clients are the same way. Regardless, they don't like to be surprised. And sellers sometimes get really shocked, and we can take that shock away by doing prior planning. Great.
Well, I think that's a really nice offer, because if you really are looking, if you're 5 years out, you better do this. If you're 10 years out, you've got some time. And even better, because you can really be, tuned to making sure that you are, one, energized, and you keep doing a really good job of keeping your numbers up, getting the right equipment that's going to make you more efficient and happy. But if you are somewhere near 5 years or less, you better have Greg come and chat with you.
Well, one of the things that I share with a lot of my clients is that you want the sale of your practice to be the frosting on your cake and not the cake. So you have to do your planning for what your lifestyle is going to be when you do this, where you're going to go, how you're going to handle your time, because a lot of dentists are very tied to their offices. That's one. It's one of the most amazing businesses in the world, but it's also one where they're so involved that sometimes they haven't planned for what they're going to do when they go.
I think that's the number one thing, is you've got 24/7 to fill. And 7 days a week, what will you do with your time when you don't have to go into the office and work, that it's just your time? And I think that's the number one thing that really hits them.
And the fact that nobody's calling them doctor anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's funny, but, there are so many charities and so many missions and things that are going on for a doctor to be able to keep their hands wet, that if they really want to just continue to be in the game, there are so many places that they can volunteer their time and really do well. But they have to have their financial cake planned, and that's why the 5 to 10 years is so important.
Well, the financial part is definitely 10 years or more out, because you want it all to work. You want to be that 85% that are successful, not somewhere lower than that where you are hoping that it's all going to be good for you. Well, Greg,
that's exactly correct.
Thank you. I mean, this is great information. I know that people are really, been taking notes about it. Let's see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Monica. And Greg, the lines are open. If you do have a question, just go ahead and speak up. And I see a couple came through on the webcast. Hi, Monica and Greg. How much does the brand and name of the dental practice matter? For example, Doc Holliday's dental practice worth more or less than an identical practice named Central Valley Dental Practice?
Good question. Answer is, when it's very personalized, it can be difficult. If it's generalized, it's a little easier because it's not branded strictly to the doctor. So if I had a 50-50 bet, I would want to lay on the side of the generalization, not the specific. Not to say that they should change it tomorrow, but it does make it more interesting.
Okay.
So can we address that one more time? So if it's in the name of the doctor, I mean, it's going to be pretty specific. It's Dr. Holliday's Dental Practice, and you're saying that's a bad thing than something that says Northwoods Dental Practice?
I'm not saying bad. I'm saying that it is more challenging because everybody's still trying to find him. If it changes hands, they're going to try to find him. It becomes an issue of the solicitation, depending on what the doctor's doing. If they're moving 25 miles away to start a new office, or they're moving to another, if they've got 3 offices and now they're moving that out, it does make it challenging. Of course, the doctor can always change the name on the face, the buyer, and do a reopening as. The biggest thing in that whole shot will be that you always want a good transfer letter between the buyer and the seller.
Right.
A transition letter to the patient base. And it has to have both their pictures on it, and they have to be showing teeth. They have to smile. That's what we do here. We do teeth. And if you do that right, and it's a good handoff letter, then it really doesn't matter what's on the front of the building. The patients will still come and give the buyer a shot. And that's what they're doing all the time anyway.
Right. Okay.
Next question, Greg came on late. If dentist selling wants to stay on, any suggestion on how long we should want to keep them?
You want to keep it, as I say, most of the ones that I see that the attorneys prepare and I've seen in the past are 6-month renewables. I've had some doctors working 5 years down the road for the person that they sold it to. Mm-hmm. But I think that every 6 months or so you need to kind of evaluate it. The one big thing is that there has to be some outs, and that's why I say you want an attorney to draft it, because let's say that you think that you want the seller in there. So you go through this whole set of hoops, and then after a month you find out that every time that seller raises his eyebrow, the staff goes strange. And you've decided that you can handle this. But do you have anything that allows you to handle that with the seller that you just signed a 6-month contract to? So that's where it gets down to one-on-one, really understanding and knowing and meeting and feeling comfortable with the buyer and the seller, feeling comfortable with each other. Because a lot of buyers perceive that they absolutely have to have that seller for that period of time. And even if they can afford it, they better be sure they understand that the personalities are going to be, especially if the seller is a strong personality, that staff is going to be following that seller's actions. And you have to determine whether or not you want to do that, have them do that.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest reasons not to keep the seller on is that you've got to make the relationships with the staff. It's now your practice. They shouldn't be going to the old seller to ask questions or for leadership. I mean, it is
and
now
the patients wanting to be put on Dr. Old's days.
Yeah. Well, when is he coming in? Yeah, I'll just wait for him to come in. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's why I like the 1 or 2 times a month consulting thing. It's not that you want them to do the dentistry. You just want to be around if you have to ask a good question.
Yeah. And again, it has to make economic sense if you're coming back and working, and the production has to be over $800,000 a year. There just isn't 2-doctor revenue in there unless you're higher than that.
You see more of that than I do. I mean, you're dealing with it every day.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Next question is, to maximize my selling price, do you recommend an associate buy in a practice first versus selling 100% to an outside buyer?
I'm not a big fan of associates coming in because it can go 2 ways. If you're really sure that you're going to sell and you're willing to enter into a contract with your buyer as exactly how that buy-in is going to take place, then you might look into that. If you're just going to bring an associate on to see what happens and then let's see if the associate wants to buy it down the road, I'm a little adverse to that for 2 reasons, and I can go both ways here. From the seller standpoint, you better have it locked down tight that individual cannot go down the street and open up a door and start a dental office. And understand that in the state of California, an associate covenant not to compete is actually, it's not enforceable. And you can ask the big attorneys, the Pat Woods, the Barry Jocelsons, the Lee Maddoxes, the Sherry Mustofis, they're all going to tell you it's not enforceable. So, and the reason is that real money doesn't change hands for that covenant. From the associate side, I'm always leery of having associates do that because usually when they come into the practice, they revitalize it. It comes up. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is the sale times comes and everybody starts to hiss at each other and it's usually not the seller that's the problem, it's the seller's spouse. Doc was working 5 days a week, and now we got an associate, and he only needs to work 4, and we're making more money than we've seen in the last 20 years. Why in the hell should we sell it now? Well, I had an agreement with the associate I'd sell it. Well, is it in writing? Well, what if he quits? We'll just find another guy like him. It worked fine the first time. And so I've seen associates work for people for 2 years under the assumption they were going to buy and then have the seller change their mind and they don't have anything legal to stand on. And even if they have it written, they got to take them to court to try to do something about it. There's $25,000 for starters. So I would say that it's better if it's a clean shot to an outside associate. If you have somebody working in your practice already and they have said that they would like to buy your practice, then I'm fine with that. It's just bringing somebody in specifically to ramp it up to see if they think about maybe buying it in the future. I think it's limiting your buyer pool a lot.
Okay, thanks, Greg. And Tim from Northridge asked a similar question. I think you just answered it. Last one that I see, dentists have multiple practices all going through one corp. How do you suggest presenting the P&L or breaking out expenses for one office, Monica or Greg?
And we see that a lot, right?
Yeah, we do see it a lot.
We see doctors that have multiple offices, and whenever I'm reviewing it, my questions always are, how do you know that they didn't buy some things for one office and put it in the one they're not selling to make the expenses look better on the one that they are selling? It's always a problematic issue for me, or even putting more of the income into the office they're selling to make it look better than the one they're not selling. It's always problematic to me when there's multiple offices within one set of financial statements. It's best if the doctors keep each office separate as a separate corporation. It's difficult.
I'm 100% behind you. I have doctors who I've worked with for nigh on 20 years that have got now, they started with one and now they have multiple offices. everyone that I have told to keep it completely separate, new corporation, completely separate set of books, separate bank accounts. Yes, it is costly to do it that way, but I'll tell you what, it's even more costly when you go to get out of it and nobody can get it apart.
Yep.
And I just have a doctor that I just listed recently, and we actually have 2 full-price offers on his practice within 10 days of it going to market. And that doctor was one of the ones who listened. So when I went to the bank today with this package, the bank says, well, what about the other office? I says, totally separate entities. And the bank goes, thank God. Because they don't want to have to deal with it, because it becomes a problem also of getting a loan.
Yeah, and it is costly. You have to set up another entity. I get that. But the other is credit cards. You've got to have not only separate bank accounts, you cannot be using the same credit cards for each one, because I guarantee you there's an issue about that too.
That's an interesting point. Thank you very much. I just learned something tonight.
You've got to make sure it's all being kept separately, because I can, many of my doctors, they want the miles. They have, 3 credit cards because they want the miles. They put everything they can on the credit cards. Well, if you're sharing credit cards between offices, even if you have separate entities, it can become a problem. You really want separate credit cards per office, too.
Great idea. Thank you.
The last one that came through, Monica and Greg, was just, Tim said, hi, Monica and Greg, thanks for the great information. And I think that's it from the online standpoint. I don't hear any others on the phone, so I think we're good with the Q&A.
Okay, well, listen, I've really appreciated being here. A lot of fun.
Well, Greg, it was great. So, again, your last slide, why don't you give us your just, verbally, why don't you give them your telephone number and your information?
Contact?
In case they're not.
Sure. Mm-hmm. The phone number is 909-542-4891, and my email is at info@gregbeamer.com. Very simple and clean.
And Beamer is Beamer. And
just like the car.
There we go, just like the car. And Tim, thank you for that nice comment, and we do hope that you enjoyed it. Greg, thank you for your time. As always, Jeff, thank you for your time, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Good night.